So I want to know, how did you come into, why and when did you start using documentary theater or verbatim theater as a tool, major tool for you, major approach for you?
Sure. So it was an accident, to be honest. Back in 2002, I was working on another show with another company, and I was in the kind of early years of. I started a company back in 1998 called Version 1.0, and the first couple of Version 1.0 shows were. Devised works. We were a group of young artists recently out of university, and we devised some shows. They were fun, and we didn't really know what we were doing because making it up, and that was good. But we made a show in 2001 called The Second Last Supper, and The Second Last Supper was this kind of crazy. This crazy show with food and wine, and in which we did a corporate reenactment dinner of the Last Supper. So it was very silly, and it was very fun, and we drank a lot of real food and real alcohol, and threaded throughout the show were a couple of documents that were about university restructures and the kind of corporatisation of universities within the show. And a year later, I was working on something else, and I was at the University of Sydney. There's a studio there that is made available to artists to make work, which is very good. And in the corridor, on the way to the studio, Dr. Paul Dwyer from the University of Sydney, who I've subsequently worked with quite a number of times, he bailed me up and said, "I've just been reading this Senate inquiry. You should do something with it. And you should make a show with this." And he gave me 20 pages of a Senate inquiry that was called the Senate Select Committee into a Certain Maritime Incident, which was investigating the so-called Children Overboard affair of 2001. So there's a political scandal that it was alleged by government that refugees were deliberately throwing their children off boats in order to force the Australian Navy to rescue them, and thereby claim asylum. And this claim was made during an election campaign, and it was a very big deal because it was subsequently proved to be not correct. So it was, whether it was a mistake or a lie or whatever. Anyway, so after the election, which the government won, there was this Senate inquiry to investigate this so-called Children Overboard affair, and the Senate inquiry was quite a dry, boring, political-based inquiry in many ways. But the particular excerpt that Paul had been reading was this 20-page excerpt from the inquiry, in which the senators were talking constantly about what constituted theatre. So it was a bunch of politicians. The context for this was that one of the witnesses claimed that it had been requested that she meet with her former boss to discuss her testimony for the inquiry. And so the opposition senators seized on this and said, "Oh, this witness has been rehearsed, and therefore their testimony cannot be accurate because they are only acting." And then there was this extended discussion over the semantic distinction between authentic testimony and performance and acting. And so it became this very post-structural meta-discussion about art within a Senate inquiry. And Paul kind of thought that would be great fodder for a piece of theatre, and that we should all have lots of alcohol and get really drunk whilst working with the transcripts of this inquiry, based on the previous show that we had made. And I thought that sounded fun. And so I said, okay, well, I will propose to make a work out of this material. And so then I read the rest of the Senate inquiry. It was about 2,500 pages of Senate transcript, and I proposed to do a show. I was successful in getting funding for that show from the Australia Council for the Arts and from Arts New South Wales. I was in Sydney at the time, and so started to make the show. And I had thought that it would be a very irreverent, disrespectful ridiculous show. But it actually turned out to be, I got very interested in the rhetorical strategies being used throughout the inquiry. And so it actually did become a very serious investigation of the way in which politicians use language to construct refugee identities in this case. And much to my surprise, that was a very successful show. I kind of thought it would, that no one would be interested in this. This was too dry, this was too boring, this was too strange. And in fact, actually, the season was a great success. We did a return season, we did a season in Canberra, and the show had a great impact. And after that, there was this sense of, well, what are you doing next? And I said, well, there's clearly more business here in political transcripts, then I should do another work in that vein. And so I proposed to do a show called The Wages of Spin that was about the selling of the war in Iraq. Again, the idea was that it would be based on political transcripts of inquiries. Again, I was successful in getting funding for this, and so set out to make it. I found that the inquiry transcripts weren't very interesting in this case, and so we then blended speeches from parliamentarians with media interviews, which was quite productive. And that kind of set a trajectory of the next decade of work, which became about working with documentary materials around political scandals. In 2011, kind of moved a little bit away from the inquiry-based shows and started doing shows based on conversations with people. So in 2011, we did make an inquiry show called The Table of Knowledge, which is about a sex scandal that involved a local government. It was around development, kind of urban development building. And but the other show that I made that year was called The Disappearances Project. The Disappearances Project was based on the experiences of people left behind in long-term missing persons cases. So what is it like to, if you don't know what's happened to your loved one or your friend or your family member, and they might be dead, they're probably dead, but you don't know, there's not a body. And that was a really, it's a kind of immensely emotional subject matter, but it was a very satisfying show to make as an artist. It was, for me, the kind of perfect melding of verbatim materials with a kind of, not perfect, but a really satisfying aesthetic frame. The dramaturgy in that work, the visuals in that work, just felt, for me as an artist, that was very satisfying, and I very much wanted to keep exploring that territory. So it's much quieter, it's much more conversation-based. It's not the kind of loud political scandals that had characterised past work. I left Version 1.0 in 2012 and began working as a freelance artist with other companies. And the first show that I made after leaving Version 1.0 was a show called Quiet Faith. And Quiet Faith very much had a similar model to Disappearances Project. It was based on conversations with ordinary people about an issue that was of deep personal significance to them. It was about the way in which people dealt with institutions, but it wasn't big and flashy and loud. It was deliberately intimate. So it was originally an accident, but it has provided a long trajectory of work that has changed in many ways as well. Yeah.
So, I don't. You said this kind of theatre has given you a lot of satisfaction. Can you say a bit more, apart from being, as you said in the beginning, is a bit accidental, and then because it's so successful and it, well, more or less prompt you in that direction. But I think there must be something, as you said, something artistically satisfying. So that makes you continue to use this kind of form, verbatim or documentary theatre technique.
I'm very interested in documentary materials, but also I'm interested in finding ways of communicating them. So I make theatre, so I'm interested in shaping experiences for audiences. So there is a challenge to take various kinds of verbatim or documentary materials from the real world and shape them, craft them in such a way as to provide a satisfying experience for an audience, or to take the audience on a journey of some kind. So that's the business that I'm engaged in, that you're engaged in, and it is very satisfying to take these very unlikely materials, these materials that might be boring or extremely complex, or and sometimes that the boringness and complexity is deliberate because particularly sometimes powerful people, they don't want you to deal with complexity. They don't want us as ordinary citizens to delve too deeply into these kinds of things. They want things to remain complicated and opaque to ordinary citizens. So there is a satisfaction in trying to unpack that stuff in some way and find a beautiful or a frightening or some kind of emotionally engaging way of dealing with that material. So I guess they're the kinds of satisfactions I have. I'm interested in what documentary and verbatim materials can do in theatre. What can that theatre look like? There is this idea that verbatim theatre is often just talking heads, like this video. It's someone talking directly or more or less directly to an audience. And verbatim theatre absolutely can be that, but it also can be other kinds of things. It can create other kinds of encounters with audiences. And they're the kinds of encounters that ordinary citizens who make up audiences don't necessarily have the capacity to have on a day-to-day basis. So I think it's satisfying when you can use verbatim materials to make a very special piece of theatre that provides a powerful experience for audiences. That's the satisfying thing.
Yes, but is there need after doing quite a number of shows, documentary and verbatim performances, and to me the most headache, the greatest headache is when you face with such a large amount of materials and you try to find a story, trying to find a thread out of all these materials. So what's your experience? When you face such a large amount of materials and you have talked to so many people for example, I think in Quiet Faith or Grace Under Pressure, you talk to so many people, then what's your experience? What's the challenge, and how did you solve that?
Yeah, okay. So those strategies vary from project to project. So I found the usual work process is that there is a gathering phase. So once you have an idea, you work out what the frame of the idea is. Usually a title comes for me fairly early. So I need something, the title becomes a kind of a coat hanger on which the show can hang. But the precise nature of what the show is and how it works, often the strategies suggest themselves from the material. So there is a process of gathering the material and then immersing myself in the material, becoming obsessed with it in a way. Usually, it's that kind of thing when you stare at it long enough, patterns emerge, and the patterns may be really simple, like they may be a repeated word or a repeated image. So in the Disappearances project, people from the material that's gathered, people continually use the sense of being stuck or frozen or paralysed or unable to move on. Yeah. So this image of stasis. But as a parallel experience, they kept talking about constantly seeing the missing person out of the corner of their eye. So there was these two images that became the structuring principles for the piece. The staging of the piece is very much driven by those two principles. That there are two actors in that show. They sit in chairs. They don't move. The show is 57 minutes long, and the actors stand once. They stand up and they sit down, and it's a very big. It's a big gesture when they do that, because the physical vocabulary of the work is so restrained. Yeah, so this idea of restraint became a really important principle in that work. And behind the actors is a continuous tracking shot out of the window of a car driving through an empty town over the course of a night. And so that became a really important way of framing how the material worked over time. With other shows, it's gathering the thematic threads. So Quiet Faith, for instance, the structuring of the show actually came from the structuring of the questions. So I asked people 3 main questions. I asked them to describe their journey of faith. So how did they come to faith? Quiet Faith, by the way, was interviews with Australian Christians about their thoughts about the relationship between religion and politics. So the first question was their journey of faith. The second question was the place of faith in their everyday life. So how does faith manifest in their daily life? And the third question was what do they think is or should be the relationship between religion and politics? And I kind of thought that when I was doing these interviews, I kind of thought that the first 2 questions were warm-up questions. They were the rapport-building questions. They were the way of framing a conversation with people. But actually, the richest material came from those questions. The third question actually got really boring answers because it's a really boring question. Almost every instance, the third question got a short answer. There were a couple of references to a particular bit of scripture, money lenders in the temple and give to Caesar what is Caesar's, those kind of biblical references. And it's a very limited and limiting question, but the first 2 questions actually contained all the material that I needed to shape the show. They were about people finding themselves, losing themselves, facing challenges, and finding answers, not the kind of be-all and end-all answers that live with them the rest of their days, but finding ways to ask questions to enable them to keep going and continue to do good work in big and small ways. And that was a surprise, but the material offered that, and that was great. So the material offers strategies to deal with the material, but I usually don't know what they are before I become obsessed with them.
Yes, and I found that most of the time you perform it yourself too, and is it a regular practice for you? And because I only found the exception is from Grace Under Pressure, but all the other shows I see in your web seems that all performed by you. Is it your regular practice?
Yeah, look, I would say no, but there's so many examples of me performing in the work. There is in some ways, it's a matter of economics. In other ways, it's a matter of time. I have constantly tried to not perform in work, and in Grace Under Pressure and the Disappearances Project, I succeeded in that aim. I actually find just not being in the work much more stressful, because there is a sense that if I'm on stage, I can keep track of how the audience is going. But if I'm not on the stage, if I'm on stage, I can make amendments. I can adjust the flow of ideas. I can adjust the course. But directing work, I find it's both very satisfying when it all works and really stressful, because once it starts, you can't do anything. You have to sit in the audience, and every single little tiny glitch or stumble over a word feels I feel the impact of that. But so I try not to be a control freak and do everything, but I certainly have done that in the past. I'm trying to do that less and less. Grace Under Pressure, I succeeded in that very much, which is great. I've just started work on a new project called Public Good, and it had a similar aim to Grace Under Pressure in that I'd be interviewing public servants, people who work in public service, talking to them about their professional lives, about their journeys, the ways in which their work has changed over the decades, or years, or months in some cases. And that was very much designed, the frame of that was very much designed for me not to perform in it. I've just done one development of it and trying to find a way into the material. The only way I've found into it so far is for me to narrate it. So I again am failing in my aim to remove myself from the work. We'll see.
So how did you choose your topics? For example, like you're working on a show talking to public servants, and for example, to faith, is it? So it's a commission things, or you start this idea and then you ask around for funding?
I mean, like lots of people, I always have lots of ideas, and I have a good sense of what could possibly be a show or a project, and what might not be. And then from that, I've been very good over the years about building partnerships with presenting organisations, so venues, companies, funding bodies. So usually to make the shows, I need to gather resources first. Sometimes shows require lots of resources. Sometimes they require very little resources. So I usually want the partnership arrangements in place before I start making it. I can have a title, I can have a description of the hypothetical work, I can write funding applications that talk about the work as if it exists, but it usually doesn't exist in any shape until there's some kind of sense that someone will invest in it in some way. There are lots of ideas. Not all of them get up. There are other ideas that sit in the drawer that maybe one day will be a show, but they're not a show because someone didn't believe in them, or I wasn't able to find the right pathway to gather resources to make them possible. So does that kind of answer that question?
Yeah, sort of. There are some other trends in the documentary theatre field that would tend to use, mainly in Europe, we tend to use what we call real people on stage. Yes, but it seems that that's not your tendency. So what do you think about that trend?
I think it's really interesting. So companies like Rimini Protocol are very much working in that area. I'm very interested in their work. I have their book. And when you talk to Meg Mumford and Carolyn Wake, Meg has researched Rimini Protocol's work quite a lot. So I'm very interested in that mode of practice. I'm just not quite sure how to do it. So it's not my, personally, it hasn't been my skill set. I've been very interested in the idea of doing it, but as artists, we return to some of the same processes. We challenge ourselves in different ways, using a royal we here. But I find that I'm able to push my practice in certain directions, to work with different collaborators, to work with different methods at different scales. I'm certainly interested in that as an idea, but the kinds of work that I've made in the past and continue to make are very much based on an idea that I have interview material that I shape, that I edit, that I craft in a quasi-musical way. That doesn't necessarily align with the idea of getting real people to perform that work, because I'm interested in in a kind of fine editing structure that does require actors to be able to successfully deliver, if that makes any sense. Certainly, I'm very open to the possibility of working with real people, but actors are also real people.
Yes. and as a director, do you think is there a particular way to direct a documentary theater performance or a verbatim theater performance? In relationship to, with regards to conventional drama, is there a particular way to direct a documentary theater performance? Do you think?
Yeah, look, it's a kind of complicated question because a lot of my theatre making practice is wrapped up in a very particular aesthetic, which isn't especially interested in characters. So my aesthetic education, I suppose, was very much oriented around a Sydney culture that originated out of an organisation called Performance Space that still exists, but not in the same way that it did. And there was very much a community of artists there that were making work that was engaged in a relationship with an audience, but wasn't very interested in characters. So a lot of my verbatim theatre work, documentary theatre work, is very much through that lens. So what the Germans might call a post-dramatic tradition, whereas the actor is always the actor, but they are putting on a role which they put on and take off and transform in various ways. So there certainly is a lot of English theatre in a verbatim documentary mode, which would be directed very differently to the kinds of work that I do. I always work in, while the words are hyperreal, I do work in a fairly non-naturalistic mode. Actors do talk directly to an audience. In Grace Under Pressure, for instance, the actors all perform in a very natural mode, as if it is them talking directly to an audience. But the way it's presented is very unnatural. It is an environment of 13 microphones. The movement from character to character is actually indicated in a spatial manner. Quiet Faith operates the same way, though the audience positioning is very different. So there are 18 characters 18 voices in Grace Under Pressure, and the 13 microphone positions. And every time the actor returns to a character, it's spatialised. And so that does reference in some ways the fact that it was an interview process, that these things were all recorded. They were all, there are various glitches with an interviewing process. One of the interviewees, their phone rings during an interview. That's in the show. There's a moment where the recorder is switched off and the show pauses and then continues. So there is, the kind of the material reality of where this stuff came from is referenced in the process of presenting the show. So is there a mode of directing it? I try and aim for a particular kind of precision from performers that I try and match myself. I don't consider myself to be an expert performer, though I do regularly do it. But I don't have a transformative acting craft. I've been very blessed of late to work with some very good actors. The actors in Grace Under Pressure are quite extraordinary, and we're really able to find very distinct and very tiny characterizations that made each voice different. So I learnt a lot through that process on how to shape such a complex story with so many different voices in a way that makes sense to an audience. So I keep coming back to how does it make sense to an audience. But yeah, I learn constantly through that process.
So, it seems you have done quite a number of shows already. Is there one particular show that you done most satisfied with yourself, and is there one show that you think sort of you stumble and you think there's still much room for an improvement.
There's certainly many shows that there was much room for improvement. Yes, in my version 1.0 years, there were very, very many shows that were that were not amazing in any way. There were some shows that were like half excellent, and the other half, just kind of, not fantastic. I like to think that I learnt something from all of them, though every time I make a new work, I'm kind of trying to solve the last one, but the new work is never the last one. It always is its own thing. So I'm always trying to catch up a little bit. Most satisfying, I certainly did find the Disappearances Project a very satisfying show. It was one of those unique meetings of, there was a very small team on that show. It was myself, Yana Taylor, Irving Gregory, and Paul Prestopino, who's a sound artist. And we had a very clear idea. We found some really beautiful materials that illustrated that idea. Yana and I worked out a very clear staging strategy that I was able to really rigorously adhere to, because this was a change too. Version 1.0 shows in the past they'd been big, they'd been sprawling, they'd been loud, they'd been raucous, and that was part of the pleasure of them. But Disappearances Project was a very austere and very sustained show. It had one staging idea that persisted for the entire duration of the show. And I suppose having the courage to actually go, no, this works. This only works if we stick to it through the duration. And so having a theory, testing it, and sticking to it, I think that was really satisfying. And kind of gave me the confidence to make a show like Grace Under Pressure, to like Quiet Faith, which had a similar thing. It had a very clear staging principle. It had one relationship with an audience that it stuck to, and for the duration, and having the courage to dwell in one idea for the journey of a show. Was really fantastic. It's not to say that all of my shows will operate in that way in the future, but it was really good to be able to have the courage to stick to something. Yeah.
So I want to ask a bit about Grace Under Pressure. This is a show that you were being approached, or you started, the idea came from you yourself? Is it a show that you were being approached, or you start the idea yourself? Okay,
so Grace Under Pressure was a show that came about as once again as a conversation with Paul Dwyer. So in mid 2015, I had a conversation with Paul Dwyer about. We had a coffee. He wanted me to join his football team, which, he applied an appropriate amount of pressure to get me to join his old man football team, which I did, and then he promptly injured himself, and then I injured myself, and as happens when middle-aged people play football. But the other part of that conversation was he mentioned that he'd started doing these forum theatre workshops with groups of young doctors, and that was part of a strategy to try and build resilience for doctors dealing with cultures of bullying and harassment and teaching by humiliation in their training process. And he was saying, well, look, the stories that I'm hearing when I do these workshops, these cultures are horrendous, and I think there's a verbatim theatre show in this. And I went, oh, okay, that sounds nice. And I put it out of my mind. The following year, I started work for the Seymour Centre. The Seymour Centre is a performing arts centre that's within the University of Sydney. And I I'd been engaged as a programmer for that venue, which is great. It was a great job, a frustrating job in many ways, but it was also a really great job. I learned a lot. But I'd been employed because the director of the venue was himself directing a show and had realised that actually he'd run out of time to develop the program for the following year. And so I had a month to make an annual program for a venue, which is a large challenge. And so the streams of programming that I had to develop were very much interested in engagements between artists' work and the work of university researchers and academics, because it's a university arts centre. And and I remembered this conversation that I'd had with Paul, and I saw a call for expressions of interest for commissions for a new festival that was an arts and mental health festival, which is called The Big Anxiety. And there was a very fast turnaround. There was like a 10-day turnaround from seeing the advertisement and the expression of interest being due. And so I rang up Paul and I said, look, that doctor bullying show idea that you had ages ago, do you think that has a mental health aspect? And he went, absolutely. So I set up a meeting the following day with himself and Dr. Kimberly Ivory, who's a medical doctor at the University of Sydney, and we had a talk about it. And I said, well, look, there's this opportunity to get some resources to make a show, and it's a very fast turnaround. What do you think? And they said, okay, that sounds great. Here's some reports, here's some things that we've written in the past. And basically, in 2 days, I wrote a proposal for a show, a hypothetical show that sounded like it existed, based on all these interviews that we obviously have capacity to do with doctors. The initial brief was very much just doctors for The Big Anxiety. And so that expression of interest was successful. It jumped through the first hoop, was shortlisted, and then there was a more elaborate second level process that I had to do to actually kind of be a bit more specific about what this hypothetical show was. And at that point, the Paul and Kimberly were part of a group calling themselves the Sydney Arts and Health Collective, which is a group of health and medical academics at the University of Sydney, which also included amongst their cohort some nursing academics. I did not realise it at the time, but there is quite a strong hierarchical divide between doctors and nurses within hospitals in particular. And so the nursing academics within the Sydney Arts and Health Collective were very strong advocates that the hypothetical show had to deal with nursing perspectives as well as doctors. And so it was an idea that was suggested by someone else, but I found the partner. I saw an opportunity, brought the partners together, and got the resourcing to make it happen. But it was a very rapid process.
I see because I can just read the script. In the script is only the characters are only named for their position, for their job nature, and they are not named as an individual character. Is it something that you decide in the beginning or along the process, or because of some ethical reasons, or sensitivity because it's too sensitive to name a particular person?
Yes to all. So the show Grace Under Pressure became a university research project, so there was an ethics agreement in place that did require anonymity of the interviewees, but it is also a high-stakes environment with professional consequences, particularly for younger health professionals. So some of the younger interviewees in the show who were talking about sexual harassment, these are young doctors in their mid to late 20s. their advancement. I mean, part of the immense problem with bullying in the training of doctors in particular is that your advancement within the profession is very much linked to ingratiating yourself to seniors, and therefore any complaints that people make are very much they have adverse career consequences. They have in the past, they continue to do so, despite there being now formal processes of various kinds to try and deal with that. The consequences remain. Certainly some people who we interviewed in the show did subsequently out themselves. Person one, so the published script has roles. The script that the actors and all the creative team work with, actually each of the characters is just numbered. Person one, I think, is referred to in the script as a physician. So Currency Press, who published it, didn't like the idea that each of the characters just had a number. So consultant physician. The consultant physician character did out herself to the actors. Like, she talked about what she meant by particular lines that were used in the play that to the actor, who got a bit uncomfortable because there was someone that she knew. And there were other. The doctor who has the long story about the car, dealing with the car crash in the country hospital. She attended the show on 2 occasions, and in a post-show discussion after the show, announced to the audience that was her story and talked about her experience. Every effort was made to make those characters as anonymous as possible, including removing the names of geographic locations, in some cases shifting genders where possible. But those doctors and nursing staff were very keen to personalise those stories to their colleagues, at least. So some people outed themselves during the run.
So, apart from having satisfaction as an artist, do you think documentary theatre? Well, one of the very last questions. Do you think documentary theatre or verbatim theatre has any benefits to the society, or do you think it is important or not? Look, absolutely. I mean, the reason to make theatre out of these kinds of materials is to open some kind of a public conversation around issues of importance. I mean, if it wasn't important, then we should just be producing existing plays or building houses or something. Certainly there have been cases where the works that I've made have produced really rich and productive conversations. Grace Under Pressure is a case in point. That show continues to have a great impact within the health sector as a way, because there is a huge desire for cultural change within hospitals, particularly around bullying and sexual harassment, and Grace Under Pressure has provided, the show has provided an opportunity to talk about some of these issues in a way that there hasn't seemed to be in the past. It was a show whose moment had come. It was the right thing at the right time. Quiet Faith, also, there were some very rich conversations with people who's, interestingly, largely older people who said, you're talking about my life in this show, and I haven't heard people talk about my life before. And so that was a very satisfying very satisfying for me as an artist, but also as a citizen, to talk about the ways in which these ordinary people who identify themselves as Christians had felt that their religious faith was being used for political purposes that they felt very uncomfortable with. I mean, these were very rich conversations in post-show forums and in informal discussions with people. So certainly the idea that work can intervene in some way to help shape conversations, to try and change cultures, that's
great. That's fantastic, and that's the motivating factor for why do this. But there's got to be other satisfactions as well. Like otherwise, you know, I feel sometimes that I've flipped from being an expert in one thing to being an expert in another thing. You know, in 2017, the shows that I made were about bullying and harassment in hospitals, so workplace cultures in hospitals, and about football in Sydney. So they're very, very different subjects, and to try and meaningfully be an expert in both of those things, it does stretch the brain a little bit. And each new show that I make requires me to develop some kind of degree of expertise, at least at a conversational level, in something new, and it's always something new. So that will become too exhausting at some point. I haven't quite reached that point, but I can see that point now.
Yes, that's there's so much resonance about what you said to me. Yeah, because for a documentary piece, you really need to delve into the subjects very deep, and sometimes it's exhausting.
Yeah, but also we don't stay there. Yeah, so I made this show, Grace Under Pressure, talking with people working within the health sector about their workplace cultures. I don't live in that workplace culture. I don't have to go back to that. I can make the show, I can shape the show, I can put the show on the stage, I can shape forums around it, I can even talk about workshop structures and try and tour the show. I don't have to go back and work in the hospital. But the people who live in that world, they do. So, you know, me as the artist, I'll move on to something else. But all the people that I spoke to, that's the world that they live in. And yeah, it's something that I need to remember, that, you know, we have a responsibility as artists as well, that, you know, we'll just move on. And we have that privilege, and it's a wonderful privilege to immerse ourselves in other people's lives, but we have a responsibility to do so in an ethical and respectful manner as well.
Yes. So one last question is, because I'm really not familiar with the Australian theatre, so do you think documentary theatre or verbatim theatre is a trend in Australia, or is just one of the usual, one of the performance mode here? Is it there a trend?
It certainly has become much more prominent. So there are some very notable historical examples of documentary theatre in Australia. You're going to talk to Paul Brown next week, who was one of the instigators of Aftershocks, which is one of the very...
we saw that in Adelaide. Yeah. A student production in Adelaide.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Yeah, right. So that's one of the very significant early examples of verbatim theatre in Australia. It certainly did become much more significant and much more prevalent as a response to our kind of post-2001, kind of late 90s, there was a wave of documentary-based verbatim plays around asylum seeker policy. Carolyn Wake is very much an expert in that area, and you're talking to her next week. So it became a mode of trying to express or bring to light the kinds of stories that ordinary Australians weren't hearing. And so there was certainly a lot of examples of that kind of work. I think there are a lot of artists in Australia who've been using verbatim materials, interview-based materials, found materials for quite different purposes. To try and shape different kinds of experiences. Artists like Rosalind Odes, who makes headphone verbatim, so she conducts interviews and then does audio scripts for actors, so the actors listen to the words and then try and channel the person that they're speaking from. But there are certainly, I think there are artists in Australia who are interested in the aesthetic possibilities of the verbatim art form, much more so than necessarily the political impact of the documentary theatre art form. I find it's become very interesting to me that there's a large number of artists in Australia who are interested in the art of documentary theatre as opposed to the politics of it. So, I'm
You
interested in both.
yourself will lean towards the later, right?
Look, and I am interested in both because it's the political, social impact of it that makes it important, but it's the art that makes it interesting to me. Finding an artful way to shape this material, that's the thing that's satisfying to me. But the motivation is to try and do good try and make something positive happen in the world. But I think there are other artists who the politics of it is they don't really mind. They're interested in gathering material that they can do something else with. And I'm interested in that too.